The year was 1876, and the town of Dry Creek, Arizona, sat beneath a relentless desert sun, its streets little more than packed earth and drifting dust. The wind carried the dry sting of sand across cracked wooden boardwalks, rattling loose shutters, and whistling through gaps in ramshackle saloon doors. Horses stood tethered outside the Black Cactus Saloon, their flanks slick with sweat, tails swishing lazily against swarms of desert flies. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of whiskey, tobacco, and horse manure. In a place where law was as brittle as the desert bones, every whisper carried weight, every shadow seemed to hold secrets. The townsfolk, hardened by drought and disappointment, were suspicious by nature, but even they had begun to notice that something darker than hunger or heat lingered in the air. Inside the general store, women clutched flour sacks against their chests and spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward the dusty road where the sheriff's office stood. Men at the saloon leaned on the bar, their boots caked in trail dust, their eyes narrowed with that peculiar curiosity only boredom and whiskey can sharpen. They spoke of cattle rustlers and miners vanishing in the hills. But soon, their talk shifted, as it always did, to the subject of Samuel Harding and his wife Eliza. Samuel was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cruel streak, known to gamble recklessly and drink until his voice turned mean. Eliza, in contrast, was quiet, her pale face set like stone, her eyes a shade too sharp for a woman who spent most of her time at home. People said Samuel treated her harshly, though no one dared say it too loud. Out here, a man's home was his castle, and what happened behind closed doors was a matter best left unspoken. Dry Creek was a place where silence often did more damage than words. Folks had seen bruises peeking out from beneath Eliza's sleeves when she fetched water, the way she flinched when Samuel's voice thundered through the street. Children too young to understand cruelty but old enough to sense danger whispered about hearing shouting late into the night from the Harding home, a small, crooked house set apart from town, where the desert crept right up to the back door. Samuel was feared, but he was also useful. He could drink with the ranchers, fight with the drifters, and bully the storekeepers into debts they knew they could never settle. He carried himself like a man untouchable, and that arrogance made him careless. Eliza had once been admired in Dry Creek. When she first arrived years earlier, she carried herself with a grace the town rarely saw. Her hair a rich brown that caught sunlight like copper. Her voice soft but assured. She came from somewhere east. Some said Kansas, others swore Missouri. And there had been talk that she married Samuel in haste, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of fear. But the years had withered her beauty and stolen her softness. Now she moved like a shadow, her face pale, her body thin, her hands calloused from work that seemed endless. Yet behind her eyes there lingered something unspoken, resentment, fire, or perhaps a madness still waiting to surface. At night, the saloon doors swung with drunken laughter, but down the road the Harding house glowed faintly with lamplight. Neighbors sometimes swore they heard the sharp crash of glass or the heavy thud of furniture against the floor. When Samuel's voice rose in anger, Eliza's replies were rarely heard, and if they were, they carried a tone of quiet defiance, almost dangerous in its calm. Those who had witnessed Samuel in town knew him as quick to anger, quicker with his fists. He would slam his cards down, curse the dealer, shove a man from his stool just for looking too long in Eliza's direction. More than one man had ended up bloodied in the street because Samuel thought he'd glanced at his wife the wrong way. But when Eliza's eyes followed him, there was no fear in them, only something colder, a silence sharper than any blade. The Wild West was unforgiving, but in Dry Creek people knew survival meant compromise. Men gambled away fortunes and rode into the desert, never to return. Women buried children beneath the scorched earth and rose the next morning to cook bread as if nothing had happened. Violence was a language everyone understood, but in the Harding household, it had become its own religion. Samuel treated Eliza less like a partner and more like property. He demanded obedience, food on the table, silence when he spoke, and loyalty no matter how deep his sins. Rumors said he kept company with other women, that he'd spent nights in the arms of saloon girls while Eliza sat waiting in the dark, her hands folded neatly in her lap. No one knew for certain, but they suspected. Out here, suspicion was often as good as truth. One evening, just as the sun bled out across the desert and turned the sky a bruised violet, Eliza walked into town to fetch kerosene. She moved quietly, avoiding the gaze of others, but the storekeeper's wife noticed the raw redness around her eyes. Samuel followed not long after, swaggering into the saloon, his laughter loud and brash, slapping men on the back, boasting of winnings that no one believed. To the townsfolk, it was just another evening in Dry Creek, another night where cruelty was hidden in plain sight. But in Eliza's silence, there was a storm brewing. The town itself seemed complicit in their tragedy. The sheriff looked the other way when Samuel staggered drunk through the street, cursing his wife loud enough for the whole town to hear. The preacher prayed for families, but avoided the Harding doorstep. Even neighbors close enough to hear the violence pulled their curtains shut and convinced themselves that it was not their place to interfere. In the West, people believed in minding their own business, but sometimes that silence planted seeds far more dangerous than words ever could. There was a night when Samuel stumbled home later than usual, the stench of whiskey heavy on him, his boots dragging through the dirt like he carried the desert itself on his back. He slammed the door open and threw his hat on the table. Eliza was waiting, dinner already cold, the lamplight casting her shadow long across the wall. He shouted something crude, insulting, cruel enough to make even the walls shudder. But Eliza did not flinch this time. She set her hands on the table, steady as stone, and simply stared at him. It was a look not of fear, but of calculation. Samuel, too drunk to notice, laughed and cursed again. But anyone watching closely would have seen it. A moment so small, yet so telling, when the weight of years seemed to shift inside her, when patience gave way to something far more dangerous. The town of Dry Creek would never forget 1876. They would remember the dust storms, the drought, and the violence that seemed stitched into their very soil. But above all, they would remember the Harding house, the whispers that grew into rumors, the rumors that grew into horror. For within those crooked walls, beneath the blistering Arizona sun, a wife's silence was turning into resolve, and a story was about to unfold that would stain the desert with blood and echo in the whispers of Dry Creek for generations to come. Eliza. Harding sat by the window of her small, crooked house, the kerosene lamp burning low beside her. The flame bent with the draft of the desert wind, shadows crawling long and uneasy across the walls. Her hands lay folded in her lap, pale and still, but her mind wandered far from the silence of that room. She had learned long ago that silence could be a prison, and if sharpened carefully enough, a weapon. Tonight, her thoughts drifted backward through the years that had led her to this point, to this house, to this life that felt more like a sentence than a marriage. She remembered Kansas, where the grass grew tall enough to hide a child, and the air smelled of rain before the storms. Her father had been a stern man, quick with his belt, quick with his drink. She had grown up fearing the heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards, and yet she had survived it, convinced that one day she would marry into something better. Freedom, kindness, perhaps even love. Those were the things she thought waited for her beyond her father's shadow. When Samuel Harding rode into her life, tall in the saddle, voice confident, eyes glinting with promises, She thought she had found that escape. She was barely more than a girl, eager to leave behind her childhood scars. Marriage seemed salvation. But salvation has a way of disguising itself as damnation. Samuel had been charming once. She could still hear the way his voice softened when he first courted her, could still see the way he tipped his hat and smiled, as though she were the only woman in the world. He promised adventure, a new life in the Arizona territory, where opportunity grew like gold in the ground. She followed him willingly, carrying with her nothing but a trunk of clothes and a handful of dreams. But dreams wilt quickly in the desert. The days stretched long, the nights cold, and the man she married began to change. Or perhaps he had never been what she thought at all. It began with words. Samuel's voice, once warm, grew sharp, critical. Useless, he muttered when dinner was late. Lazy, when she failed to scrub the floors to his liking. He laughed at her ideas, dismissed her fears, treated her kindness as weakness. Then the words turned into shoves, slaps, bruises she hid beneath her sleeves. She remembered standing at the well one morning, the sun rising behind her, her hands trembling as she drew water, trying to ignore the ache in her ribs from the night before. The neighbors had looked away. They always did. Out here, a woman was a man's property, and no one interfered with property. But the cruelty didn't stop with fists. Samuel had secrets, ones that crawled into Eliza's mind late at night when she lay awake listening to his drunken snores. There were whispers of other women, saloon girls with painted faces and hollow laughs. There were rumors of debts owed to men who would slit a throat for less than $1. Once, she found a letter tucked into his coat, scribbled words from a woman in Tucson, tender and pleading. She never asked him about it. She didn't need to. The truth sat heavy in her chest like a stone. Her life became a cycle of endurance. Wake early, work hard, endure Samuel's temper, pray for moments of quiet. She learned to keep her voice low, her movements careful, her emotions hidden. But inside her, something was growing. Rage, yes, but not the wild, reckless kind. Hers was slow, deliberate, simmering like water on a low fire. Years of humiliation fed it. Each bruise, each insult, each betrayal added weight, until the silence she carried was no longer weakness, but strength, coiled, waiting. She thought often of escape. In the stillness of night, she imagined walking into the desert, leaving Samuel to rot in his bed. She pictured boarding a train, east, returning to Kansas, maybe even finding her sisters, starting over. But she knew better. Samuel would never let her go. Men like him did not release their grip. They tightened it until there was nothing left to break. She was trapped in a cage with a man who thrived on her fear. And so, if freedom would not come by leaving, it would have to come by another path. Sometimes in the quiet hours when Samuel was gone, Eliza spoke to herself. "You can't go on like this," she whispered into the silence. "You can't die here, with him crushing the breath out of you." Her voice would tremble, but her eyes would harden. She knew her breaking point was near. She could feel it. In her bones, in the weight of her chest, in the way her hands lingered too long on the butcher knife when she prepared supper. She remembered the first time he struck her hard enough to make her bleed. The taste of iron in her mouth. The way the world tilted, the ringing in her ears. She had looked up at him, dazed, waiting for apology or regret. Instead, he had laughed. Laughed. That sound had lodged itself deep within her, echoing even now. It was then that she knew he would never stop. He would kill her eventually, not with a single blow, but with years of cruelty that stripped her, soul piece by piece. Unless, of course, she killed him first. The thought had come uninvited, sharp as lightning. At first it horrified her. But horror gave way to consideration. She began to notice his habits more carefully. The way he stumbled, drunk, the way he fell into heavy sleep after nights at the saloon, the way his temper left him blind to caution. She began to imagine scenarios in which he didn't wake up. Sometimes it was an accident, a fall, a misstep into the desert. Other times it was deliberate, a knife, a bottle, a rope. Each time she pushed the thought away, and yet it always returned stronger than before. Eliza's rage was not only for herself. It was for the years stolen from her, the woman she could have been if not bound to Samuel Harding. It was for the whispers of neighbors who pitied her but never intervened, for the preacher who preached patience instead of justice, for the sheriff who saw the bruises and looked the other way. It was for the nights she lay awake, heart pounding, wondering if tonight would be the night Samuel killed her in his drunken rage. It was for the silence of every woman in Dry Creek who endured her suffering quietly, because that was all the world expected of them. Now, as she sat by the window, staring into the desert night, Eliza felt that silence cracking. Inside her, something shifted, as if a door had opened and could never again be closed. Her breaking point was no longer approaching. It was here. She could taste it in the air, thick as the dust storms that rolled across the desert, suffocating everything in their path. She could hear it in the steady thump of her heart, in the way her breath caught when she thought of freedom, true freedom. "You've given him enough," she told herself in the dark. "More than enough. He's taken everything. Now it's time to take something back." The words hung heavy in the air, spoken to no one, and yet to everyone who had ever wronged her. In that moment, Eliza knew there was no turning back. Seeds of hatred had been planted long ago, watered with cruelty, fed by betrayal. Now they had grown, deep roots twisting into her soul, branches reaching toward a single, inevitable act. She did not yet know when or how, but she knew this. Samuel Harding would not leave Dry Creek alive. And when she thought of that, for the first time in years, Eliza almost smiled. The Harding house sat alone against the desert night, its crooked frame groaning softly as the wind pressed against its walls. A thin slice of moon hung overhead, pale and cold, casting long shadows across the barren ground. Inside, the air was heavy, still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The lamp on the table burned low, its flame bending and straightening with every draught, throwing restless patterns across the floorboards. Eliza sat in that half-light, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. She had waited for this moment, though not in the way one waits for a guest or a prayer to be answered. This waiting was heavy, tense, sharpened by years of silence that had finally found their voice. She could hear him before she saw him. Samuel's boots scuffed against the dirt road outside, his uneven gait betraying the whiskey in his blood. The sound grew louder, closer, until the front door rattled under the force of his hand. It swung open, and he stumbled in, shoulders broad, hat askew, face flushed with liquor. He muttered curses under his breath, tossing his coat carelessly over the chair, his presence filling the room like smoke choking the air. Eliza did not move. She watched him with a calmness that was not calm at all, but something sharper, controlled, deliberate. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, every beat a drum of both terror and anticipation. Tonight was different. Tonight, her silence had teeth. Samuel noticed her then, sitting so still, her face pale in the lamplight. "What are you staring at?" he barked, his voice thick, heavy. He grabbed the bottle he had brought home, tipped it back, and laughed, though it was a hollow sound. His laugh had once charmed her. Now it only hollowed her further. "Dinner's cold," she said softly. Her voice barely rose above the crackle of the lamp, yet it carried with it something unyielding. Samuel sneered, slamming the bottle down on the table. "Cold. Like you." He spat, his hand reaching for the plate she had set earlier. The food had long since hardened, forgotten in its waiting. He scooped it up with his hand, chewing noisily, dripping crumbs across the table. Then, as if to remind her of her place, he hurled the plate to the floor. It shattered, the sound echoing through the small house like a gunshot. Eliza did not flinch. She had stopped flinching long ago. Her eyes followed him as he turned away, fumbling with his boots, cursing at the stubborn laces. She rose then, slow, steady, her fingers brushing against the kitchen counter where the knife lay. It was not chosen in haste. It had been waiting, just as she had. Her hand wrapped around the handle, cool and familiar, as though it had been made for this very night. She stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Samuel looked up, confusion flashing across his face before dissolving into a drunken scowl. "What are you doing with that?" he slurred, his words tumbling into each other. He tried to laugh again, but it faltered when he saw her eyes, steady, unblinking, almost serene. In that silence, time slowed. The room seemed to shrink, the flame of the lamp stretching tall, casting both of their shadows long across the wall. Hers was slender, sharp, rising like a blade. His was broad, stumbling, already broken. Her breath came shallow, yet steady, as she lifted the knife. Her arm trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the moment, from the years pressing down behind it. She thought of every bruise, every insult, every night she had lain awake while he staggered home from another woman's arms. She thought of the letter tucked in his coat, the laughter that had mocked her pain, the way the town had looked away. And in that moment, her silence became louder than his voice had ever been. The knife came down, a swift, sure motion. Samuel's cry tore through the air, raw, startled, stripped of power. The lamp quivered as if in witness, its flame flickering violently. Shadows danced wildly across the walls, their forms grotesque, twisting. The smell of iron filled the room, mingling with the sharp tang of kerosene, heavy and suffocating. He staggered, clutching at the table, his eyes wide with shock. For the first time in years, she saw fear in them, not hers, but his. He tried to speak, to curse, to command. But no words came. The strength that had once towered over her now crumbled, his body faltering, heavy against the fragile wood of the chair. Eliza stood above him, her chest heaving, her grip still tight around the knife. Relief surged through her veins, mingling with terror, with grief, with something darker. The years of silence cracked open inside her, releasing a flood she could not control. She watched him slump, his power draining away, his shadow shrinking against the wall until it seemed to vanish altogether. The room grew unbearably quiet. Only the lamp hummed, its flame steady now, as though satisfied. Eliza's eyes fixed on the spreading darkness beneath him, the way it crept across the floorboards like a stain, reaching toward the flickering light. For a moment, it looked as though the lamp and the blood were in conversation, one feeding the other, fire and life mixing in some grim pact. Her hand loosened, the knife clattering softly against the table. She stepped back, her body trembling, her breath uneven. And yet, beneath the tremors, there was something else, an unfamiliar calm. For the first time in years, Samuel's voice would not wake her in the night. His laughter would not mock her, his fists would not bruise her. He was silent, finally and forever. She stood there, staring at the scene, a storm of emotions tearing through her. Anger still burned, sharp and searing, but relief dulled its edges. Fear pricked at her, whispering of consequences, of discovery, of gallows. And yet, above it all, there was a strange sense of freedom, fragile but undeniable. The lamp sputtered. Once, then steadied. Eliza reached out and adjusted its wick, her fingers steady once more. The room smelled of iron and smoke, of endings and beginnings. She knew the night had only just begun, that what she had done would not remain hidden for long. But in that small, suffocating house, beneath the pale light of a desert moon, Eliza Harding felt the weight of silence lift from her shoulders. The house creaked again, shifting in the wind. Outside, the desert stretched endless and indifferent. But inside, something irreversible had taken place. The woman who had once cowered in fear was gone, replaced by someone colder, stronger, untethered. She looked down at the lifeless form before her, and though her eyes stung with tears, her lips curved, just barely, into the faintest trace of a smile. The night of murder was done, and with it, the seed of something darker began to grow. The room was still, too still, as though time itself had frozen to watch what she had done. Eliza stood over the lifeless body of her husband, the knife still lying where it had fallen, the lamplight glinting off its stained edge. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, her chest rising and falling with the shock of it all. For a long moment, panic ruled her. Her hands shook violently, her knees buckled beneath her, and she clutched the back of a chair to steady herself. "What have I done?" she whispered into the empty air, her voice cracking, fragile, as if spoken from someone else's lips. Her ears rang with the echo of Samuel's last cry, the sound bouncing again and again inside her skull until she thought it might split her in two. Her eyes darted toward the window, half expecting to see neighbors peering in, half expecting the sheriff himself to be standing there already. But there was nothing. Only the darkness of the desert night pressing against the glass. Her first instinct was to hide it, to drag his body into the desert, let the coyotes strip him to bone, let the sand bury what was left. She imagined pulling his heavy frame across the floor, down the steps, leaving behind a trail that would only betray her. The desert was vast, but Samuel was not a man who could disappear quietly. People would ask questions. People would come looking. Her panic rose like a tide, swelling until she felt she might drown in it. She pressed her palms against her face, willing herself to wake, to find this all a nightmare. But when she lowered her hands, Samuel was still. There, slumped and silent, his shadow twisted across the floor. No dream. No escape. And then, as suddenly as panic had come, calm began to seep into her bones. Cold, deliberate, unnatural calm. It was the kind of calm that comes not from safety, but from decision. Eliza's breath steadied, her trembling slowed. Her eyes narrowed on the body at her feet, and in that silence, an idea surfaced, horrifying yet strangely clear. She thought of the way Samuel had always controlled her, stripped her of dignity, treated her as nothing but a servant. To his whims, he had eaten at her table with cruelty in his mouth, demanded food as though it were his right, never once seeing the hands that prepared it. For years she had cooked his meals, fed his hunger, endured his appetite. Now, staring at him lifeless, on the floor, she felt something shift inside her, something sharp and twisted. "Let him be consumed," she murmured, her voice steady now, almost serene. The words startled her at first, but once spoken they rooted themselves in her mind. If the desert could not claim him, if the earth itself would not swallow him, then she would decide how he vanished, not buried, not hidden, consumed. The thought was madness, she knew. It coiled around her like a snake, whispering of horror, of blasphemy. And yet, in its horror, there was a sense of justice. Samuel had always taken from her, her youth, her pride, her freedom. Perhaps now she could take something back. Perhaps now she could feed others the way he had fed on her suffering. They would never know, of course. They would sit at her table, laugh, talk, share stories, never realizing what they had swallowed. The power of it, the revenge of it, filled her with a dark exhilaration. Her eyes fell on the kitchen, its humble stove, its iron pots, its wooden counters worn smooth from years of labor. This was her domain, the only place Samuel never tried to control, because he considered it beneath him. How fitting, then, that his end should come here, in the space he thought so little of. She almost laughed at the thought, though the sound caught in her throat like a sob. Eliza knelt beside the body, her hands no longer trembling. She studied him, the man who had been her tormentor, her jailer, her executioner in all but name. His face was slack now, emptied of cruelty, emptied of power. He looked smaller in death, almost pitiful. Almost. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, and for a moment, grief flickered in her chest. Once, long ago, she had believed she loved him. That memory stung. But love had long since rotted into something foul. "You always said you owned me," she whispered, her voice low, intimate. "But now I own you. Every last piece of you." The words sent a shiver through her, both terrifying and thrilling. She rose, steadying herself, and moved to the stove. Her hands were sure as they gathered pots, kindling, utensils. The motions, so ordinary they almost disguised the grotesque intent behind them. The fire crackled to life, the smell of burning wood filling the room. Shadows danced across the walls, mingling with the silence, watching as if in witness. Eliza returned to Samuel, the iron pot already heating. Her mind no longer fought the thought. It embraced it, shaped it, justified it. This was not madness, she told herself. This was balance, punishment, justice. The town had turned a blind eye to her suffering, had allowed Samuel's cruelty to thrive unchecked. Let them eat at her table, smile at her cooking, praise her skill, never knowing the truth. Let them share in the burden they had ignored. A strange calm washed over her as she worked, as though she were merely preparing another meal. The tasks were familiar, the motions automatic. Yet beneath that calm pulsed a current of dread and exhilaration, tangled together until she could no longer tell them apart. Each step deepened her resolve, each breath carried her further from who she had been. The lamplight flickered, stretching her shadow across the walls. It looked taller now, sharper, as though the house itself no longer contained her. Samuel's shadow lay still, diminished, broken. In that contrast, Eliza felt the power of her decision. She had been silent for too long, but silence had given birth to something stronger than fear. By the time the fire roared steady and the first pot hissed with heat, Eliza's heart no longer raced with panic. It beat with grim determination. The path before her was unthinkable, but she had already stepped onto it, and there was no turning back. She looked once more at Samuel, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You always wanted to be part of me," she whispered. "Now you will be part of all of them." And with that, she began. The kitchen flickered with firelight, the kind that gave warmth in the cold desert night. But this warmth was twisted, heavy with the burden of what Eliza had chosen to do. The stove hissed and popped as kindling caught, flames licking the blackened iron like a beast hungry for more. To anyone else, this room was the heart of a home, a place where bread was kneaded and soup was stirred, where families gathered for comfort. To Eliza, it was now an altar, a stage where the ordinary and the unthinkable would blend into one. She moved with startling composure, her feet silent against the wood, her body guided not by panic, but by something steadier, darker. She pulled utensils from their hooks, pots from their shelves, setting them out in an orderly fashion, as if she were preparing for a Sunday supper. Her fingers moved with the memory of years spent cooking for Samuel, but tonight her purpose was new, almost sacred in its horror. The sound of the knife sliding against the cutting board cut through the silence like a whisper too sharp to ignore. It was not gore that filled the room. It was the rhythm, the steady sound of blade against wood, an echo of domestic ritual. How many times had she stood here, slicing onions, chopping meat, preparing dishes Samuel never thanked her for? Memory burned in her chest, but instead of sorrow, it fueled her resolve. This, she thought, was justice hidden in plain sight. The smell of smoke from the fire mingled with something heavier now, the kind of scent that lingered in the walls, that clung to the skin. It was not yet unbearable, but it was enough to make her aware of the wrongness of it. Her nose caught every note, and though part of her recoiled, another part pressed forward, determined not to falter. Madness crept in around the edges of her thoughts, whispering doubts, but she silenced them with the hiss of boiling water. Every action carried a double meaning. The ladle swirling through the pot could have belonged to any housewife preparing stew for her family, yet in this moment it became a ritual of desecration. The clatter of the spoon against the iron wasn't just sound, it was accusation, a reminder of what she was doing. And still, she did not stop. She worked with a strange care, as though presentation mattered, as though the horror would somehow be lessened if the act itself carried grace. She wiped her hands on a cloth, arranged her tools, straightened jars of spices on the shelf. Her orderliness was unsettling, the calm of someone who had surrendered fully to their choice. It was as if she had stepped outside herself and was watching, an actress in a play she both despised and relished. Inside her mind, voices battled for dominance. One screamed that she was lost, that she had crossed a line no soul could return from. Another whispered reassurance, telling her that this was her liberation, her only path to freedom. She felt herself slipping between the two, half in control, half unraveling. She hummed under her breath at one point, an old hymn she used to sing as a girl, the melody warped now by its setting. The sound chilled her own ears, but she did not stop humming. The ordinary mixed with the grotesque. The crackle of the fire was comforting, yet what it cooked was abominable. The knife's weight in her hand was familiar, but its purpose now was monstrous. The aroma rising from the pot was almost domestic, the kind of scent that might once have drawn Samuel into the kitchen with a greedy smile. The thought sent a tremor through her, because tonight he was the meal. Her face betrayed nothing. She stirred slowly, rhythmically, her eyes fixed on the swirl of broth. She thought of the faces of her neighbors, the men at the saloon, the women who whispered about her misery, but never lifted a hand to help. She thought of how they would smile at her table, compliment her skill, never knowing the truth. The power of that knowledge burned inside her, hotter than the fire itself. "Eat, then," she murmured softly to the room, though no one was there to hear. "Eat what you ignored. Swallow what you let fester." The words startled her, but they also steadied her. She was not simply destroying Samuel, she was transforming him, feeding him back into the very community that had turned its back on her suffering. Her vengeance would not be loud or violent, it would be quiet, polite, shared across plates and bowls, swallowed with laughter and conversation. The kitchen seemed to change as she worked. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for her. The creak of the house shifted with each gust of desert wind, as though the building itself was uneasy with what it contained. Yet Eliza stood unmoved, her presence commanding, her calm more terrifying than any panic could have been. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when doubt pricked her heart. She would pause, her hand hovering over the pot, her mind whispering, "This is wrong. Stop now. Stop before it is too late." But each time, she looked back at Samuel's empty chair by the table, the chair where he had sat night after night, sneering, belittling, breaking her spirit. and each time her resolve hardened like iron in the flames. Her hair clung damp to her forehead, the heat of the fire wrapping around her, sweat beading at her temples. She felt as though she were dissolving into the kitchen itself, becoming part of its atmosphere. The smoke, the flame, the knife, the pot. Her humanity thinned, replaced by something more primal, more relentless. Yet within that transformation, there was clarity, control. For the first time in years, she was the one directing her life, however horrifying the direction might be. The stew bubbled steadily, the sound oddly soothing, like a lullaby of boiling water. She stirred again, her face illuminated by the glow of the fire, her eyes glassy but unflinching. Madness had begun to lace through her thoughts, but it was not the frenzied kind. It was quiet, disciplined, deliberate. The madness of someone who has accepted the unacceptable and found purpose in it. When at last she stepped back from the stove, she wiped her hands slowly on her apron. She looked at the pot, steam rising into the air, carrying with it a smell both ordinary and obscene. She stood there in silence, watching it, listening to it, as though waiting for some final confirmation from the universe. And in that silence, she smiled, small, almost imperceptible, but real. The wife who had once trembled under her husband's shadow was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone who had turned the very act of cooking into an execution, a sermon, and a curse. The stew simmered. The house creaked. The desert night pressed against the windows. And Eliza, steady and unyielding, waited for dawn. The desert sun had long since slipped below the horizon, leaving the town of Bisbee wrapped in a thick veil of shadows. Inside Eliza's modest home, the windows glowed faintly with the light of lanterns, a gentle beacon against the night. To a passerby it looked warm, inviting, just another family home preparing for an evening meal. But beneath that glow, beneath the comforting aroma of supper drifting into the street, a secret darker than any outlaw's crime was about to unfold. One by one, her guests began to arrive. The first knock rattled her door, sharp against the silence, and Eliza smoothed her apron with steady hands. She opened it to the smiling faces of her brother-in-law and his wife, their children clinging shyly at their sides. Their laughter filled the threshold, their words warm and familiar, a stark contrast to the cold knowledge hidden inside Eliza's mind. She welcomed them with a smile that reached her lips, but not her eyes, ushering them into the dining room where the table gleamed with care. Plates were set, glasses polished, bread neatly arranged in a woven basket. Everything looked ordinary. Everything had to look ordinary. Soon others followed. Neighbors, distant kin, those who considered themselves close enough to share in the comfort of a family meal. Boots scraped against the floorboards, coats were draped over chairs, voices rose in casual chatter. The small house buzzed with life, the way it often did during gatherings, with no one questioning Samuel's absence. Some assumed he was late at the saloon, others guessed he was busy with work. No one asked directly. No one seemed to care enough to notice. Eliza glided between them, her movements graceful, deliberate. She carried pitchers of water, passed around bread, asked after their children and their health. Her voice was soft, kind, the voice of a hostess who wanted nothing more than to please. But inside, beneath that calm, her thoughts twisted like smoke, dark and restless. Every smile she gave was a mask, every polite nod a veil hiding her truth. When at last the stew was brought forth, its steam rising in gentle spirals, the room filled with praise. "It smells heavenly," one woman said, inhaling deeply. "Eliza, you've always had a gift." The compliment struck her like a knife, though she did not flinch. She ladled the broth into bowls with careful hands, her face glowing with composure, her heart pounding with a rhythm that only she could hear. The children were served first, their small hands clutching spoons eagerly, their eyes bright with hunger. They dipped into the stew without hesitation, their laughter carrying across the table as they slurped noisily. The adults followed, raising their spoons, tasting, savoring. Murmurs of approval spread quickly. How tender the meat was, how rich, the flavor, how perfectly seasoned. Eliza sat with them, her posture upright, her face serene. She did not eat. Instead, she watched. Each mouthful they swallowed was a secret she held, a burden only she could feel. To them, it was a meal. To her, it was retribution woven into the fabric of everyday life. She wanted to laugh at the irony, to scream the truth into their faces, but she remained silent, her calm smile never wavering. The conversations flowed easily. One man spoke of cattle prices, another complained of dust storms ruining his crops. The women whispered about a new dressmaker in town, comparing fabrics and patterns. Laughter erupted when a boy spilled his drink, the mishap quickly mopped up with a rag. All the while, the clinking of spoons and the steady chewing filled the spaces in between. And through it all, Eliza sat at the head of the table, listening to their words, watching their lips move, watching their throats swallow. Every sound, every gesture carried an undercurrent of dread that only the audience could feel. The horror was not in what was seen, but in what was unseen. Truth hiding, in plain sight, woven seamlessly into normalcy. Her eyes drifted from face to face. Her brother-in-law, so quick to defend Samuel's cruelties, now nodded with satisfaction as he ate. His wife, who had once told Eliza to be patient, men have tempers, now smiled warmly at her over the rim of her spoon. Even the children, innocent, unaware, were part of this strange, grotesque communion. None of them knew, none of them would ever know. At moments, madness flickered in Eliza's gaze. She would stare a little too long, her smile lingering just beyond comfort, her silence stretching unnaturally before she answered a question. But her guests dismissed it as fatigue, the strain of being a widow left alone too often. They pitied her in their own way, never realizing the truth that sat in their bowls. The room grew warmer with the fire, the air thick with steam and chatter. Eliza inhaled deeply, her senses caught between revulsion and triumph. The aroma was familiar, the kind that might once have comforted her, yet now it was tainted by knowledge. She could almost feel the boundary between sanity and madness thinning, fraying as she sat there presiding over the meal like a priestess at some unholy altar. When one of the guests asked about Samuel, Eliza's heart skipped a beat. The room seemed to tighten around her, every sound suddenly sharp, every eye turned her way. But she answered with practiced ease, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "Out late, as always," she said with a faint shake of her head. "The saloon keeps him longer than I ever could." A ripple of laughter followed, knowing chuckles at Samuel's expense. The tension dissolved. The subject moved on. Inside, Eliza's relief twisted into something darker. Not only had she deceived them, she had made them complicit in mocking the man they consumed. The power of it settled into her bones, making her sit taller, straighter. She looked down the length of the table at the faces smiling back at her, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of control. She was no longer the broken wife in Samuel's shadow. She was something else entirely, something formidable, untouchable. The bowls emptied. The breadbasket was passed until nothing remained. Guests leaned back in their chairs, satisfied, their conversations slowing into a comfortable rhythm. Eliza gathered the dishes with careful hands, her smile still, serene. No one suspected, no one questioned. They left her home that night with full stomachs and warm hearts, thanking her for her kindness, praising her generosity. When the door closed behind the last of them, silence returned. Eliza stood in the empty room, her hands pressed against the back of a chair, her breath slow and steady. The table was bare, the fire dying down, the smell of the meal still hanging thick in the air. She let out a long exhale, almost a sigh, as the weight of what she had done settled deeper into her soul. For now, no one knew. For now, the horror remained hidden. But she knew it would not stay hidden forever. And yet, as she stood there in the stillness, Eliza smiled. The desert morning crept into Bisbee with its usual stillness, but beneath that stillness, something had shifted. The little town that had once gone about its business with lazy ease now hummed with an undercurrent of whispers. They carried through the saloon, drifted across the churchyard, clung to the dusty streets like smoke no wind could sweep away. At first it was nothing more than curiosity, but curiosity in a town as small as this had a way of turning sharp, biting, and relentless. It began with the family members who had dined at Eliza's table just nights before. Around their own hearths, they muttered to one another about the stew. It had been tender, yes, flavorful, yes, but something about it lingered uneasily on their tongues. Rich, one cousin said, wrinkling his brow as he spoke. Too rich, almost. His wife agreed, recalling a taste she couldn't quite place. Another relative wondered aloud if Eliza had bought a cut of meat from some wandering trader, something not common to their kitchens. No one said it outright, but each sensed something unusual, something they could not name. At first they dismissed it. Hunger made everything taste sharper, they reasoned. A tired cook might have tried new spices, or perhaps the meat had been wild game Samuel brought home before one of his drinking binges. But their unease did not leave them. It sat with them through the night, revisiting them in their dreams, stirring restless thoughts. And when morning came, unease had grown into suspicion. The absence of Samuel became harder to ignore. Days passed. No one saw him at the saloon, no one at the stables, no one on the roads. A man like him, loud, brash, unable to keep to himself, was not the kind to vanish quietly. His drinking companions laughed it off at first. Probably run off with some saloon girl, they joked, raising their mugs in mock salute. But their laughter had an edge to it, hollow and uncertain. Samuel's disappearance stretched too long, his absence too heavy. And so the whispers began. They spread from porch to porch, from the market stalls to the dusty benches outside the sheriff's office. "Have you seen Samuel?" one voice would ask. "Funny how Eliza doesn't seem too troubled. She's calmer now, isn't she?" Another voice added, "Almost different." In the bakery, two women bent their heads together, speaking low. "You remember how she smiled that night at supper? Too calm, if you ask me. Almost proud." Eliza, within her house, felt the pressure of those whispers pressing against her walls. She heard them in the scrape of boots outside her window, in the pause of conversation as she walked past, in the subtle glances cast her way at church. The weight of eyes followed her everywhere. When she poured water into a basin, she imagined neighbors peering in, watching her hands. When she stepped onto her porch, the silence of the street felt accusatory, heavy with things left unsaid. At first, she told herself it was nothing. They always gossiped, always found someone to pick apart. Samuel's absence gave them fresh fodder, nothing more. But inside, her nerves began to fray. Each time she met a gaze too direct, she wondered if they knew. Each time a conversation hushed as she entered, her chest tightened with the certainty that her secret had slipped from the shadows. Her brother-in-law was the first to approach her directly. He came to her door one afternoon, his hat in his hands, his voice hesitant. "Eliza," he began, "we've all been wondering. Samuel's been gone some time now. You haven't heard from him." His eyes searched hers, looking for cracks, for some sign of grief or worry. Eliza smiled, soft, controlled, carefully rehearsed. "He's always gone," she said lightly. "The saloon takes more of his time than I ever could. You know that." She laughed gently, though it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "If he's wandered off, perhaps the quiet will do us both some good." Her brother-in-law chuckled uneasily, nodding, but his eyes lingered too long on her face, his suspicion barely hidden. When he left, Eliza shut the door and pressed her back against it, her smile vanishing into a grimace. Her hands trembled against the wood. They were circling closer, like wolves sniffing blood. The stew haunted her too. She imagined its taste, lingering in their mouths, imagined them replaying the texture, the flavor over and over in their minds until recognition dawned. At night, when she tried to sleep, she heard the sound of spoons scraping bowls, echoing endlessly, accusingly. She saw their faces at her table, mouths chewing, throats swallowing, and she felt both triumph and terror. What if one of them had known? What if one of them had guessed? The sheriff began to ask questions, not of her, not yet, but of others. He lingered in the saloon, his voice low as he inquired about the last time Samuel was seen. He rode out to the edge of town, asking cowhands if they'd spotted him on the trails. He walked the market, ears pricked for mention of Eliza's name. Word of his interest reached her quickly. By the third day, she couldn't step outside without imagining his shadow falling over hers. Her paranoia grew sharper. The creak of floorboards at night became footsteps. The caw of a crow outside her window became a voice calling her name. She began to check the locks 3-4 times before bed, her heart racing with every click. The once steady calm that had guided her hand in the kitchen now frayed at the edges, replaced with frantic whispers of doubt. And yet even as fear gnawed at her, another part of her reveled in the secret she held. She would walk through town with her head high, a calm smile painted on her lips, and in her heart she laughed at their ignorance. They asked questions, yes. They whispered suspicions, yes. But none of them knew. None of them could ever imagine the truth. The power of that knowledge burned inside her, mingling with the terror until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The townsfolk grew restless. Some whispered that Samuel had met a violent end, perhaps in a brawl on the road. Others suggested he had abandoned Eliza, run off into the desert to escape debts. But beneath these speculations lay a darker current, one none dared speak aloud. That Eliza herself might know more than she let on. In the stillness of her kitchen, the same kitchen where it had all begun, Eliza would catch her reflection in the window glass. Her eyes looked sharper now, her smile thinner, her face lined with sleepless nights. "They don't know," she whispered to herself again and again, as if repeating it would make it true. "They'll never know." But the words no longer soothed her. They rattled in her chest like loose bones, fragile, hollow. The whispers of the town thickened with each passing day, weaving a net around her. And though no hand had reached out to accuse her yet, Eliza felt the noose tightening. Her calm facade cracked at the edges, her paranoia seeping through. And for the first time since that night, she began to wonder if perhaps she had not outsmarted them after all.